You don't just think about life. You get trapped inside it while everyone else somehow keeps moving. A random comment stays with you for 3 days. A quiet night turns into an existential spiral before midnight. You can enjoy something beautiful and still feel the sadness hiding underneath it. You notice how people laugh when they are uncomfortable. You hear what wasn't said more loudly than what was. You leave simple conversations feeling strangely heavy, like something invisible just happened. And half the time, you can't explain why. People call you intense when you are only being honest. They call you quiet when your mind was actually louder than the room. They think you're overthinking when you're really just seeing too many layers at once. That kind of depth can make ordinary life feel weirdly unreal. It can make small talk feel exhausting before it even starts. It can make happiness feel fragile because you already sense how quickly things change. And it can make you feel older than your age without feeling wiser. Because thinking deeply is not just being smart. It's often being unable to leave things at the surface. It's your brain turning every moment into a meaning hunt. It's your heart refusing to treat life like background noise. You don't just experience things. You analyze them while they're happening and replay them after they're over. A text message becomes a tone. A tone becomes a question. A question becomes a story about what it means for the relationship. That is why your mind gets tired in places other people call normal. You can sit in a crowded restaurant and feel emotionally overstimulated by everything. The volume, the faces, the pauses, the fake smiles, the hidden tension. Your system is always collecting more than it needs, and it rarely gets permission to rest. Sometimes this starts early. Maybe you grew up around moods that changed without warning. Maybe you learned to read the room before you learned to read yourself. Maybe being observant was never a personality trait. Maybe it was survival. When a child has to monitor emotional weather, depth develops fast. Not because it's glamorous, because it feels safer than being unprepared. So you become the one who notices patterns. You hear the shift in someone's voice before they admit anything is wrong. You catch the disappointment behind their politeness. You sense when someone is emotionally leaving long before they physically do. And once your mind learns that level of scanning, it doesn't easily turn off. Even in calm moments, it stays alert for meaning. Even in good relationships, it looks for cracks. Even during peace, it remembers what chaos felt like. That's one reason deep thinkers often struggle with simple enjoyment. Not because they hate life, because part of them is always watching life from a distance. They can be in a moment and outside it simultaneously. They can feel joy and study it like it might disappear. They can fall in love and still notice the grief hidden inside attachment. They can achieve something important and immediately wonder why it still feels incomplete. That isn't weakness. It's what happens when awareness outruns comfort. And people who think deeply usually know that feeling too well. They don't just ask what happened. They ask why it happened, what it reveals, and what it says about human nature. They don't just feel lonely. They ask why loneliness can exist even when other people are around. They don't just get hurt. They start tracing the roots of hurt all the way back to childhood. Sometimes this brings wisdom. Sometimes it just brings exhaustion with really good vocabulary, because not every deep thought becomes insight. A lot of it becomes emotional traffic with no clear exit. You can spend hours trying to understand yourself and still feel impossible to explain. You can understand exactly why you react the way you do, and still react that way anyway. That gap is frustrating. It makes you feel like self-awareness should have fixed more than it did. But self-awareness is not the same thing as nervous system safety. You can know your patterns and still be living inside them. You can recognize your wounds and still feel them activate in real time. You can understand your loneliness and still feel it sitting beside you. That's why deep thinkers often become unfairly hard on themselves. They believe insight should automatically create control. So when they still feel anxious, attached, avoidant, or emotionally flooded, they feel embarrassed. They think, I should be past this by now. But healing rarely moves at the speed of understanding. And that truth can be brutal for analytical people. Because your mind wants progress to be clean and measurable. Your inner life refuses. It moves in circles, symbols, body memories, and strangely timed grief. Sometimes you think you are going backward. Sometimes you're actually revisiting something more honestly than before. That's the part people rarely tell you. Deep thinking is not always elegant. Sometimes it looks like staring at the ceiling after a perfectly normal day. Sometimes it looks like feeling too much after hearing an old song. Sometimes it looks like canceling plans because your brain feels emotionally overheated. Sometimes it looks like laughing with friends, then feeling empty on the drive home. Sometimes it looks like knowing everyone likes you and still feeling misunderstood. That last one hits especially hard, because being liked is not the same as being known. A lot of deep thinkers are easy to appreciate from a distance. They listen well. They notice details. They ask real questions. They make other people feel safe to be complicated. but they often hide the depth of their own complexity. Not because they are fake, because they learned most people only want manageable versions of honesty. So they edit themselves. They translate their real thoughts into something lighter, smoother, easier to digest. They say, "I'm just tired." What they mean is, "I feel emotionally disconnected from my entire life tonight." They say, "It's whatever." What they mean is, "That hurt me more than I want to admit." They say, "I need space." What they mean is, "My mind is so full I can barely hear myself think." This is why deeply reflective people can seem calm while quietly falling apart. They know how to function inside inner chaos. They've had practice, a lot of practice, and the world often rewards that. It calls them mature because they don't make scenes. It calls them wise because they think before speaking. It calls them independent because they don't ask for much. But sometimes those compliments hide something sad. A person can look deeply composed while being profoundly alone. A person can seem self-sufficient because they stopped expecting emotional rescue. A person can be thoughtful, responsible, and insightful while secretly feeling impossible to hold. This is where depth becomes painful. Not when you see more, when you start believing nobody wants to see with you. That belief changes the way you move through life. You become careful with your tenderness. You stop explaining the full story. You give people the short version, because the real version takes too much language. And sometimes, if we're honest, you stop hoping to be fully met. You settle for being partially understood and call it enough. That kind of resignation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It just looks like being low maintenance. But inside, it feels like learning to live on emotional leftovers. Still, there is something important to say here. Thinking deeply is not the problem by itself. The pain usually comes from having depth without enough emotional grounding. It comes from carrying perception without support. It comes from having a rich inner life with nowhere safe to put it. That changes everything, because it means your sensitivity is not broken. Your mind is not defective because it asks bigger questions than most environments can hold. Your emotional intensity is not automatically dysfunction. Sometimes it is intelligence that never had the right container. Sometimes it is grief looking for language. Sometimes it is loneliness sharpened into observation. Sometimes it is the cost of being awake in places that reward numbness. And yes, sometimes it can become self-punishing. Sometimes deep thinking turns into self-surveillance. You start monitoring every reaction, every attachment, every insecurity, every shift in your mood. You become both the person in pain and the investigator studying it. That split can make rest feel undeserved, because even your quiet moments become work. You are always interpreting, always tracing, always trying to reach the final answer about yourself. But human beings are not puzzles that stay solved. You are not failing because new emotions keep appearing. You are alive, and life keeps touching different wounds. That is not the same thing as being lost. In fact, many people who think deeply are not lost at all. They are just carrying too much consciousness without enough gentleness. That's a different problem, and it deserves a different response. Not harsher self-discipline. Not another late-night spiral disguised as personal growth. Not treating every difficult emotion like a flaw needing immediate correction. Sometimes the healthier move is simpler and harder. Let the thought end before you turn it into a philosophy. Let the feeling exist before you explain it. Let silence be silence without forcing it to reveal a hidden truth. That doesn't mean becoming shallow. It means learning that depth without mercy can become its own prison. And maybe that is the real psychology here. People who think about life too deeply are often trying to make life feel safer. If they can understand it completely, maybe it won't blindside them. If they can name every pattern, maybe they can avoid old pain. If they can predict the emotional weather, maybe they can finally relax. But total understanding never arrives. Life keeps some mystery. People keep some contradiction. Love keeps some risk. And healing sometimes begins when you stop demanding certainty from a human experience. You were never meant to decode every part of being alive. Some things are only meant to be felt and carried gently. Some chapters do not become clear while you're inside them. Some questions help you grow. Others just keep you awake. Learning the difference matters, especially if your mind has spent years believing more thought always means more truth. Sometimes more thought just means more distance from yourself. And if this is you, there is nothing random about it. Your mind probably became deep for a reason. Your sensitivity probably protected something important. Your overthinking probably began as a form of emotional loyalty. Your intensity probably grew where safety felt uncertain or connection felt fragile. So no, you are not too much for noticing more than most people notice. But you may need spaces where you stop treating depth like a full-time job. You may need relationships where your inner world does not feel excessive. You may need to stop confusing emotional struggle with personal failure. And you may need to remember this one thing. Just because you think deeply does not mean you must suffer endlessly. Depth can become wisdom. Sensitivity can become discernment. Awareness can become peace when it is finally paired with compassion. Not overnight, not perfectly, but slowly enough to feel real. So if you have spent years feeling strange because life hits you harder than it should, if you have felt exhausted by your own awareness, if you have felt lonely in rooms where everyone else seemed effortlessly normal, if you have quietly wondered why your mind can never leave things alone, maybe the answer is not that something is wrong with you. Maybe you just learned to survive by seeing too much. Maybe you became fluent in emotional subtext before anyone taught you rest. Maybe your depth is not the enemy. Maybe the real wound is how often you had to carry it alone. And maybe that is why this hurts. Because the deepest thinkers are often the ones who needed gentleness the earliest. Instead, they learned interpretation. Instead, they learned restraint. Instead, they learned how to hold oceans behind a steady face. So if you see yourself in this, take this with you. You are not weak for feeling the weight of existence more than other people do. You are not broken for needing more meaning, more truth, and more emotional honesty. You are not dramatic for being changed by things others forget in an hour. You are a person whose inner world became deep for reasons that deserve respect. And maybe healing starts when you stop apologizing for that depth. Maybe peace begins when you stop turning every feeling into evidence against yourself. Maybe life becomes lighter when understanding is no longer your only form of safety. Because the goal was never to become less deep. The goal was to become less alone inside your depth. And once that happens, even a heavy mind can finally breathe.